Good morning, everyone, and very blessed Sabbath to all of you. I hope that you're keeping well and that you are managing to cope during this particularly difficult time. I would like to bring a message to you this morning, which is basically very much about the situation in which we are all facing at the moment. Which is about fear, it's about difficulties, uncertainty. And this passage is coming from the book of 1 Samuel, chapter 11. So I would like that you open your Bibles with me. And I would like to begin by having a short prayer. Our Heavenly Father, I come before you at this moment in order to ask you to be with us, to bless us, and to make this message really an inspiration for us all in order to be able to advance on the difficult paths that we have to face. Be with each one of us as we are going through the various difficulties, the various threats in our life, and we need your guidance and your support. Bless me also as I'm trying to express the ideas and the thoughts that you have instilled in my heart, in my mind. In your name we pray. Amen. I would like to start my message by bringing to your attention someone who is not very popular at the moment. I don't know whether the photographer was told to zoom in onto the Prime Minister's hairy chest in order for him to become an example of bravery for how he's getting the vaccine. But in case you haven't realized, this is Mr. Kyriakos Mitsotakis, which is at the moment trying to introduce new measures in Greece. And the way he's trying to do that is quite threatening. And I'm not personally happy with this. I have to admit that I am ashamed of someone who is trying to introduce a €100 fine for those who are over 60 and who are not have not been vaccinated. I think it's a total disgrace. But nevertheless, it's an issue, it's a development, it's a political development that has attracted a lot of attention and interest over the last few weeks since he made the announcement. And whether we like it or not, the possibility of people being fined €100 per month when the average pension is approximately €650 per month can be quite significant, because a lot of the people who are pensioners are actually supporting other family members who have lost jobs. So it's not an amount of money that they are basically taking directly for their own satisfaction. I have been considering this idea of threat. What does it mean to be under threat? And I think that it's a very, very significant topic to consider, because there are different levels and there are different degrees of threats, some of which can be very fatal, some of which can be more minor. You can be in some way feeling threatened if someone makes a complaint or is aggressive to you. But the type of threat that we experience today, and most people experience with COVID-19, it's a lot more severe, it's a lot more substantial, it's a lot more serious. Why is it serious? Because constantly people are bombarded with the idea of getting it, of catching it, and dying as a result of it. And not only dying, but also dying in a quite remorseful way, with not being able to breathe, not being able to have contact with the loved ones, not being able to have the support that they would have in normal circumstances. So, one of the things that makes this situation very frightening for a lot of people is that they might not be able to enjoy their life, that they are constantly afraid of the economy deteriorating, of not being able to afford their mortgage, of being forced to do the vaccine, especially for those that work in the health sector. And when you're being confronted with this kind of imagery and negativity and threats, somehow this pressure, this power, really challenges your psychology, your emotions, your well-being. It is not just about the economy, it's not just about people losing their jobs, but it's also about not being able to sustain their family, their children. So to be in a situation of a threat is a very, very serious thing. And I have to admit that as we're going through this pandemic, the fear element comes back to my mind in relation to stories that I have heard from my own family members or other people in Greece, where they had to go to war, where they had to actually face famine, where they actually had to make very strict provisions about how to eat, and to have to cut down on the amount of food that they would be eating, something that I haven't had the need to consider, but now I do. And what is of more important is that there is a lot of development about the chain reaction that this is going to have in various industries or in various economies. And it is this kind of uncertainty that makes it more and more challenging for people, because how can you fight an enemy which is invisible, that you cannot see? It becomes really, really hard, right? Now, in following the thread that we have been covering over the last few weeks, and which come from the book of 1 Samuel, sorry about this, the passage begins with Nahas, the Ammonite, who goes on to settle in Jabez Gilead, which is basically a territory, it's a region in which the Israelites happen to live. Now, Nahas is an Ammonite king who is settling, but is also besieging the territory in which the Israelites live. And we basically understand what is going to happen by looking at the subsequent verses, where the Israelites are offering to make a covenant with this king. So when we read in verse 1, so I'd like you to open your Bibles with me to 1 Samuel chapter 11, verse 1, where I read from the New King James Version, which says, "Then Nahas the Ammonite came up and encamped against Jabez Gilead, and all the men of Jabez said to Nahas, make a covenant with us, and we will serve you. And Ahaz the Ammonite answered them, on this condition I will make a covenant with you, that I may put out all your right eyes and bring reproach on all Israel. Yeah, what a beautiful offer really this is, right? So you're going to someone and say, okay, let's make a covenant, let's make an agreement, and the other person says, no problem, that's quite easy, I'm happy to make a covenant with you on the condition that you will only be left with one eye, right? So this is not a very encouraging response. And the thing is that what really Ahaz is saying is, I'm going to kill you. Simple as that. I will take out your right eye in case you want to keep on living with one eye. You are going to be my subordinates. You are going to serve me. And this, it is the fear, is the terror that Ahaz brings to the people of Israel that really creates shivering down the spine, and they start to cry and be sad about what's going to happen. In verse 3 we read, then the elders of Jabez said to him, hold off for 7 days, that we may send messengers to all the territory of Israel, and then if there is no one to save us, we will come out to you. So in verse 3, basically what the elders do, that they represent is the Israelites, right? Go to the king and say, give us space, give us time for 7 days, that we might get some advice about what we're going to do. So basically what they're saying to him is, okay, you're going to kill us, we know that you're more powerful than us, but before you do that, just give us grace of 7 days to see if we can find some kind of way of convincing you of how we can be of use to you. The king, the Ammonite king, Ahaz, is not joking with the Israelites. He is trying to do what he promises to do, which is to wipe them out, or to a nasty operation on the right eye that they will remember if they manage to survive it, or that's a fatal operation, if we can call it like this. And we read how people are really afraid, because when we go to verse 4, which is the next verse, it says, all the people lifted up their voice and wept. Now, one of the things that I would like to state, and which I think is very important, is that all of us, we need to realize that there is a huge difference between reading that someone is in a state of terror and being in a state of terror. I think that if this pandemic has done something very significant to most people, is to really shake the foundations of how they're living their lives, where their trust is, but also a lot of the things that we have read in the past about, wars and fighting and nations going against nation, or people going through a difficult time with not having the sufficient food, it's something that people really experience for the first time. And that is really deep, it's very personal, it's very existential. It has to do with not being able to have, or the possibility of not having an adequate amount of food in your cupboard to feed yourself or your children. It might have to do with not having enough petrol to keep warm. The possibility of not having enough, or not having sufficient food, most of the time was supplemented or addressed by people finding more work or working harder or going somewhere else. But if there is not a possibility of people fulfilling or meeting that need, then things become more serious, because it's an issue of survival. So what I'm trying to say is that if we can imagine for a minute the possibility of all of us not having literally enough days in which we live, or enough food, or enough resources, our life might be really a danger. If we really put ourselves in this kind of situation, then we realize that somehow everything that we do, everything that we think of, concentrates around this issue. There's no way that you can actually get out of your mind the fear that this situation has developed in you. And at this moment, I would like to share with you a short clip from a James Bond movie, in which James Bond is captured, and they want to get some information from him. And I only am going to play a very short, I'm not going to play the whole thing, but what I want you to do is that I want you to feel the situation in which someone like him might be in. Of course, this is a movie, right? But it doesn't matter. I think that the way he's being portrayed is quite real, and let's watch it together.
As you know all too well, then a man lives inside his head. That's where the seat of the soul is. James and I were both present recently when a man was deprived of his eyes. And the most astonishing thing happened. Didn't you notice? He wasn't there anymore. He'd gone, even though he was still alive. So this brief moment between life and death, there was nobody inside his skull. Most odd. So James, I'm going to penetrate to where you are, to the inside of your head. Now, the first probe will play with your sight, your hearing, and your balance, just with the subtlest of manipulations.
Get on with it then. Nothing can be as painful as listening to you talk.
All right. Let's begin.
Right. My intention is not to make you upset or to uh, bring to your attention things that might make it difficult for you to have lunch later, but the idea is simply to make this sermon a little bit more memorable for you by remembering the sudden gasp that he is feeling when he hears the sound of the needle getting inside his head. It's quite bad, isn't it? When you are in a state of terror, as I said, becomes very challenging because you are not able to find stable ground on which to make decisions. And finding a sense of balance in the midst of panic becomes extremely difficult. So how are we able, as Christians, as people who believe in God, to walk on this thin rope, saying that what's coming is quite gloomy, it's quite sad, it's quite upsetting? So when the Israelites find themselves in a situation where they don't have much more to live, there is panic, there is fear, there is terror, there is fear. And it is this point of tension that somehow in this passage becomes almost the very trigger, becomes like the motor that generates a series of reactions in people. It's like a spring, once you press the spring, poof, something happens. And before I come to my Roman friend Marcus Aurelius, I just want to mention that what's important and what we read in the passage in verse 5, where it says, "Now there was Saul coming behind the herd from the field, and Saul said, 'What troubles the people that they weep?' And they told him the words of the men of Jabez. Then the Spirit of God came upon Saul when he heard this news, and his anger was greatly aroused. Read this verse on your own and just think about what it says and what it means. Just take 1 minute to reflect on this verse. So, first of all, I think that you would have noticed two things. The first thing is the weird question about why they're weeping. Because if you remember, there was another guy who mentioned a similar question when the Israelites were facing off the Philistines, and that was David. He also made a similar question to the people, and in that case was, who is this guy who wants to bring shame onto us, to embarrass us. Who does he think he is, right? And the second is this word, this phrase that the Spirit of God came upon him and his anger was greatly aroused. Now, I have not done research on this word in Hebrew in order to find out, but I know from other contexts and other texts and from the study of the prophets and where the word anger is also used, the meaning, the connotation behind it is really the idea of passion or extreme excitement almost. So the word anger is used because it has to do with some kind of responsive action that comes against the event, what happened. So his anger was greatly aroused. We can think of as his strong desire for responding to this situation was so immense that he was angry for taking action. Saul comes across as a very brave man. Now, he wasn't brave for the rest of his life, as we know, because by looking into the story of Saul, we find out of how he started to develop a sense of jealousy against David, and he didn't like the possibility of someone else succeeding him as the king, right? So, what is interesting is that at the moment, at the period of his life when Saul is to play his role as the king of Israel, and where he is really feeling strong in his relationship with God, his attitude is one of almost provoking the situation itself. He's almost saying, why are you responding to this situation in this way? Now, someone, I can imagine in my thinking, right, someone going to Saul and sort of slapping him on the face and saying, you're a complete idiot, because you don't realize that this guy, the Ammonite king, wants to remove our eyes. He wants to kill us. And you're saying that what? That we can win them? The passage doesn't give us a lot of information, and my intention is not to focus on every detail in the passage because it is not really the point of the story, I think. The point of the story, in my view, is that someone, against all odds, has the audacity to stand up, has the courage to somehow view and address the situation in a very unorthodox, provocative, crazy way. He's almost claiming that this is not going to happen because we have God with us. So when in verse 9 we read that the messengers who came advised them to say, thus you shall say to the men of Jabez Gilead, tomorrow by the time the sun is hot you shall have help. Then the messengers came and reported to the men of Jabez, and they were glad because they were going to have support, reinforcement. So in verse 10, basically what they say to the king is they are saying, okay, we are going to surrender ourselves to you completely, without really disclosing that there is a plan behind it, and this is basically to try to kill and to take revenge. Now, there are two ideas that I would like to bring to your attention. One is the state, the emotional, the psychological, the cognitive, whatever state Saul is in when he goes and sort of responds in this kind of unorthodox way by challenging the people, by suggesting that this is not going to happen. That's number one. The second is how God operates in his mind and in his thinking when he goes to make this statement. In other words, why do we read in the passage? Why do we read in verse 6 that the Spirit of God came upon Saul? So are we to suggest that simply the Spirit came and he changed the way he thought about it, and from being a very shy and fearful and embarrassed individual, he simply became into an aggressive one? I don't think so. I think that Saul, as an individual, is at the peak of his spiritual life, where he really feels committed, he feels wholeheartedly accepting God, to the point that the immediate threatening situation it's serious, but it is not so serious to take away, to distort his faith in God. And this is the contrast that I would like to bring to you. So on the one hand we have fear and terror, and on the other hand we have the capacity to somehow accept the situation, not to be afraid, but also to be able to stand up with bravery and courage. Marcus Aurelius was a Roman emperor who is well known for writing out his reflections. If you search for Marcus Aurelius and his reflections, it's basically a small booklet, which is being published as a booklet now, in which he basically summarizes and captures a lot of statements that he made. And he belonged to the Stoics. The Stoics are basically a way of thinking. It's a philosophy that comes back as far as just after the succession of Socrates. And it started from someone called Zenon, who tried to systematize and develop, and he sort of added and contributed to what it means for someone to actually live life in the best possible way. And a lot of that philosophy is influenced by many ideas. There are things that we find, for example, in Socrates and Plato and Aristotle, but there are things that also are very distinctive. But one of the things that Zeno tried to do in this kind of effort was to try to make a practical application of philosophy, something that people can live by on a day-to-day basis. And this is the reason that it became so attractive, and a lot of people belong to the Stoic movement. And Marcus Aurelius was one. So a Roman emperor subscribed to this kind of ideology, and in fact he was one of the best Roman emperors. It seems that he was one who was really wise, even though he went to war and he served Rome, but nevertheless he faced a lot of issues, particularly with his wife, who had an affair with someone else, and eventually she committed suicide. And then he had another son who actually developed into a nightmare. But Marcus Aurelius was someone who really stands out for making an effort to somehow communicate and express some very important principles to people, some of which are very, very important, very wise, and I would like to share with you some of them. The happiness of your life depends upon the quality of your thoughts. Therefore, guard them accordingly, and take care that you entertain no notions unsuitable to virtue and reasonable nature. So one of the things that the Stoics believed was, like as we do, so the idea of what do you really trust yourself with? What is... So when Marcus Aurelius talks about the quality of your thoughts, he doesn't simply mean, thoughts that are coming and going, but things that sort of develop and mature as decisions, as behaviors, such as are your habitual thoughts. Such also will be the character of your mind, for the soul is dyed by the thoughts. So there is a lot of emphasis on how we basically process information, how we view a situation, how we make decisions. Another of his reflections says it is not death that a man should fear, but he should fear never beginning to live, because to live means to fear, and the only way not to fear is not to exist, basically. These, for me, are quite deep, because really bring face to face the very core, the very essence of existence. To fear is to realize your own existence. To fear, to go through a process of which is really challenging, it's almost a way of you zooming in on what is really important for you. And somehow the uncertainty and the challenge gives you the opportunity to almost come out of yourself, come out of this superficial dimension in which you live, and find out whether you can really stand on your feet as a person for what you think is right. So a nobleman compares and estimates himself by an idea which is higher than himself, and a mean man by one lower than himself. The one produces aspiration, the other ambition, which is the way in which a vulgar man aspires. So, in other words, the ambition or the jealousy of that someone developed by looking at other people, or by thinking that they are better because other people are lower, of a lower level, is it's deterring, it's stopping the person from really becoming who he really is, because you don't have to take advantage of someone in order for you to be in a better position or situation. So what I'm trying to say to you and to myself is that what seems to be happening in this passage, and which is of interest, is that Saul is facing this big challenge in his life by principally trusting and finding courage and strength and power, not in the not by looking simply at the seriousness of the situation, the possibility of death, but somehow allowing himself to be filled with this acceptance, with this faith, with this aspiration for who God is and what God can do. And somehow this act of faith and trust, at least in my view, seems to be the main element that triggers God's reaction and response. That somehow God's action on Saul, God's influence, becomes in response to a determination, to a way of thinking, as if Saul has elaborated and developed this understanding of God to such an extent in his heart that somehow the situation is serious, but he is rather able to see beyond it and through it. So, what I think is significant in this passage is that there is a vivid contrast between what Saul does by what I would like to suggest, at least, is already carried within him. So, I think, and my view is that he's not simply turning or switching from one mode to another suddenly. I think that Saul is someone who makes a genuine effort. And that's why he's being recognized and selected and identified as someone who can serve the people. But what is also interesting about this passage is that Saul does not remain this type of person for all his life. Because we know that when he considered the possibility of David coming after or being replacing him, he was filled with jealousy, which means that the experience that he had with God, the power to conquer the Ammonites, wasn't something that simply happened and remained permanent for him for the rest of his life. So, what is interesting is that this powerful experience, this powerful encounter with God is happening, he's experiencing it, he's feeling it, but is not something that remains forever. So, he changes as a person. So, from being a powerful and courageous individual, he becomes someone who is afraid of David, who becomes jealous. And it is this contrast, it is this discrepancy that basically makes me think that that's one person's experience with God, it's always in the making, that you experience God and God interacts with the person not as a single event, not as a single incident, but every challenge, every situation somehow becomes an opportunity for the person to actually find out where they stand in relation to God. So Saul goes there to rescue the Ammonites and wins. However, as the slide mentioned here, he becomes jealous of David at some other point in his life and he forgets his purpose. And what I think that we need to take out of this, and what is important, is that God seems to be very sensitive to those high moments of distress where the person is consciously willing to trust, to play against the odds, to take the risk. So there is something very magical happening with how God operates, which is shifting. It is because his behavior is filled with hope, with trust, with a strong confidence of winning and supporting his people, that allows all to find the strength. And I think that God becomes involved in the situation because he's taking the risk to consider not so much the situation that he's in, but like David said for Goliath, who is this person who thinks that can put shame on the people of God? Now, this is difficult, it is challenging, because the problem is with us human beings is that we want to be able to have a stable to be on stable ground. But at the same time, I think all of us will agree that life itself is always like a powerful sort of constant wind that comes to you and pushes you in many directions, and you have to find your balance. You have to find, somehow you need to make an effort to keep your balance. And I think that this is what's happening with what's happening right now in the world. That somehow COVID-19, the pandemic, is creating a lot of content about what is going to happen and how people are going to suffer and how we're going to suffer. And I'm very much concerned about myself, about my family, and I would be dishonest if I didn't say that I wasn't concerned. But at the same time, I find that during these dark moments of uncertainty or frustration, that I have to also think differently about what's actually happening. I don't know when God decides to act or how God decides to act. We read that the Spirit of God came upon Saul in verse 6, right? When he heard this news, his anger was greatly aroused. But there is a pattern here. You know, David fights off Goliath. He is at the peak of his experience and spiritual journey, and he becomes strong and brave. But then, over the years, he becomes comfortable with being the king with power, and he makes huge mistakes. In a similar way, Solomon, his son, is a king, becomes a king, but then somehow things deteriorate. And when he's finding himself alone and away from the wealth and concubines that he had, he writes what we have as the book of Ecclesiastes, where we, remind ourselves of the idea of vanity. So, as we are going through this challenge, and as we are threatened by the various conditions that we live right now, I think we need to remember that whether we realize it or not, the closer we come to the immediate threat, to the fearful situation, to death, to illness, to catching COVID-19, to basically dying, the more we realize how temporary we are, how fragile we can be, how sensitive we can be. But at the same time, this huge challenge for all of us, I think that it gives us an opportunity to really look inwards, to sort of become more introspective, and to find that against all odds, there is something about faith and trust that it can become very powerful. It can look very crazy for someone who is not associated with it, because as the Israelites said, what do you think is happening? Why are you asking why people are sad? Can you not see what's actually happening? Are you stupid? And I think that Saul remembers, and even when he gets older, I think that and the same for David and Solomon and for the other people, remember and understand that there is something very unique and almost magical taking place when the person is able to confront the situation, but at the same time to somehow not be limited by it. And it's a very difficult process, because you really have to put into action things that are very personal, very internal to us, things that concern our own sense of self or existence. So we are threatened by various conditions we live right now, and the development of our condition seems to be dependent on something. And I would like to ask you to fill in the remaining part and put in those bullet points what you think is the right phrase or the right words. May God bless you and keep you safe and well. Thank you for listening to the sermon. See you.